We have the same administration, we have the same Congress. Gridlock was obviously a huge issue in the last Congress. What do you see as the opportunities in the climates for moving some legislation that can really help the startup community and drive innovation?
Well, first of all, Evan, thank you for doing this, and thanks to Steve Case for being behind a lot of this. I understand Cheyenne retiring a niche did one of the early warm-up things. I am actually more optimistic. One, I was pleased with the election results, and I think that the first order of business, before we get to the kind of issues that I know we're going to talk about in terms of Startup 2.0 and the Jobs Act and other things, is until unless we get our balance sheet right, at least starting to deal with the so-called fiscal cliff, what have you, that we may not be able to get to all these other issues. This is like until we lance this boil, we're not going to be able to move beyond it. Why I'm optimistic, more optimistic than I was before the election, was that I do think some of the crowd who'd been hired in 2010, who are more kind of just, let's stick a spoke in the, a stick in the wheel and try to just be obstructionist, some of that movement seems to have receded. I think there were many people around. I think about my good friend Tim Kaine, who got elected underneath the aegis of the Let's Get Stuff Fixed caucus, which is important, I think. And there are a group of us, particularly in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, dozens and dozens on both sides, who are very, very committed to getting this done. So the necessity of not driving over the cliff, I think, will drive us towards something. The other factor that is different than the previous couple times we have miserably missed the debt ceiling and the failure of the super committee is that the one outside effort that wasn't around the previous two times is the business community, more the big business community, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, recognize now that getting this wrong would do more to their bottom line on a negative basis, and getting it right, as the Australian foreign minister said recently, America's one budget deal away from economic preeminence for decades to come. So the upside downside of this is enormous. And they, rather than sitting on the sidelines where they have been through most of this debate so far, are actually meaningfully investing. So there is this group called Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. There's something called now a Campaign to Fix the Debt. It's raised $40 million. My hope is that number will double. And there are lots and lots of businesses involved in it, so that there's actually going to be some institutional support mechanism, so that when a Congressman X or Senator Y actually comes out for something that raises revenues and changes entitlement programs, and they get the incoming from the normal, interest groups, there will be a group to respond or a group to actually reinforce good behavior. One of the things that I know this is a mostly entrepreneurial group, and will confirm your worst views about kind of how politics is done, but even for me, as somebody who's been involved in politics a long time, when I got to the Senate, it was really fairly stunning how little institutional support there is for people really to put country or macro interests ahead of individual interests. And Tom, I know, looking at it from the White House end, you see that all the time as well. Lots of groups out there that say, oh, I'm all for this, but don't touch mine. And until we realize that every one of us is going to have some skin in the game on getting this fixed, we're not going to get it done. I do think we'll get there this time, though.
So one of the premises of this, this whole conference is that startups really need to step up more and drive more of the innovation that America is great at these big challenges, at education, at healthcare, and really try to reinvent these things. Does the budget going forward, we hear a lot about what the fiscal cliff is negative for business and the economy. Does it create opportunities for these kinds of startups? Is there going to be new opportunities to do new things in education reform, for example, from a financial standpoint?
I think only if we get it right. Let me make two comments. And one, the smart group follows stuff. Those who weren't focused entirely on their BlackBerries at this point. But I think it is important to reflect just on a top-line basis how we got here, if you don't kind of follow all the ins and outs of this. How did we get from surplus 12 years ago to 16 trillion so quickly? And remember, everything I'm going to talk about now is within a 10-year window, because that's the way the referee is CBO. That's the way they score things. Look at what America did over the last 12 years. And both parties have got, this is not an accusation, both parties have got blame on their hand. We took $4.5 trillion out of the revenue run rate with the so-called Bush-Obama tax cuts. We could have probably done that if at the same time we hadn't done 5 things on the spend side, many of them necessary, but that just made this equation totally broken. We doubled defense spending, some of that necessary after post 9/11. We created a whole new category of spending called Homeland Security that didn't exist before. We went to war not once but twice entirely on the credit card. Some of us in this room are old enough to remember, Vietnam, which was not very popular, but you got to give Nixon credit. At least he didn't put it on the credit card. He put an income tax surcharge in place to help pay for it. Fourth thing we did was we gave seniors in the country a great new benefit in terms of getting them free and reduced prices on prescription drugs. Pretty good program. Cost $1 trillion, didn't pay a dime for it. And the real culprit of this is the fact that we are aging and living longer, which is a great blessing. I always like to ask smart crowds like this, who knows who originally set 65 as a retirement age? Any of y'all know? Bismarck. And think about it. It was a great political promise back in the 1870s, 1880s. We're going to give you a check if you hit 65 when the actuarial tables had life expectancy in mid-50s. Perfect political promise, you outlive the tables 10 years. The situation is now, if you are a healthy woman in America at age 20, your life expectancy is 100. That's great, but it does mean the math around the entitlement programs is broken. And when we get to the question, and I am going to answer the question about educational opportunities and others, one of my biggest challenges with, for example, Mr. Ryan's budget plan was that if you are a business, and as an investor, I've spent longer as an investor than I have as a politician, when I looked at business plans, I would look at 3 things on any business I'd invest in. Tell me about your workforce. Tell me where the business is investing in its plant and equipment, whether you're developing software or making widgets. And do you have a plan in a globally competitive economy to stay ahead of your competition? Governments do the same thing. We just call it different names. We call it education and workforce training. We call it infrastructure in terms of roads, highways, airports, broadband. And kind of our competitive edge really boils down to basic research and development that wouldn't be done by the private sector. The challenge why we've got to get the fiscal cliff dealt with and the budget dealt with is that we may not go to the Ryan plan, but we would be close to it almost regardless if we don't get entitlements and revenues done. Mr. Ryan's plan took the 16% of federal spending on what's called domestic discretionary spending over about a 20-year basis to less than 5%. Tell me how America, if we're talking about opportunities for investment, how America is going to compete with China, India, Brazil, even the Europeans, if you're spending less than 5% of your public resources educating your workforce, building your bridges and roads and doing basic R&D. It's a bad business plan. So if we get our deficit kind of plan in place, we don't have to solve it all. You got to get $4 trillion over the next 10 years. I think that will allow us to go back to saying, okay, how do you move forward on educational reform? Which I think is a great opportunity. I think the promise of technology in education has not been realized yet. I don't think anybody's really figured that out. I think other opportunity areas. This is both kind of good side and bad side. I'm on the Intel committee. If I was starting again right now, the cyberspace is enormous challenges and opportunities business-wise. It's going to be confusing. I still think modeling and simulation, which has been mostly on the defense side, but there's wonderful opportunities in that area. And obviously, I think continuing technology, the promise around healthcare is taking a lot longer than any of us had anticipated. And even with the kind of explosion of natural gas in America, which is a good thing, energy over the next still quarter century, I think there'll be more wealth and jobs created worldwide in that sector than any other sector.
So let's assume we get the fiscal cliff resolved here, and we do it the right way. So pivoting back to the
check that box.
Check. We've done that. We've solved first big problem, which I know has been one that's been tackling
I'm a little obsessed
for quite a while. Yeah. So do the election results make it easier to move on elements of the Startup 2.0 Act, for example, involving immigration, involving how do we get more highly skilled workers here? How do we keep a lot of the talent that we're producing here.
Amen. And remember, as Steve is often, we're in a competition for capital and talent. And one of the things the Jobs Act did was potentially through crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, I'm sure you've had panels on already, but democratize capital raising, potentially take people in my former business of VCs, I don't think out of the mix, but I think the biggest upside on crowdfunding, crowdsourcing is actually going to be in rural and smaller communities, which doesn't have as access to as much early stage capital, enormously potentially powerful. We got to make sure that we get the kind of regulatory framework right, that we don't overdo it. But I have to say, those who think we're going to simply self-regulate, we could have a couple of scams come out of this and dramatically cut back on this potential if we don't get that right. So we'll put that over here. On the talent piece, the Startup 2.0 really basically took the low-hanging fruit around immigration reform, which said, in effect, let's go ahead, and if you've got a graduate degree in the STEM fields, not undergraduate, but graduate degree, we're going to make it much, much easier to get that green card. And if you're already here on an H-1B, and you've in effect become an indentured servant to technology company, big technology company X, and you now have got the idea to go out and become that entrepreneur, we're going to give you a path to doing that easier than our current thresholds at about $1 million. We actually lowered it, probably wouldn't stay this low, to $100,000, and you hire a couple of Americans. There's some sweet spot in there. I think it will be, on one hand, easier, the fact that we've got Jerry Moran, for example, from Kansas, one of my original co-sponsor, Marco Rubio, has been very good on this. The only concern that I have is that because the president was so successful, particularly with Hispanic voters and Asian voters, others, would be that the pressure to kind of take the low-hanging fruit versus the pressure to do comprehensive immigration reform. I think the win behind comprehensive immigration reform is much stronger now after this election. And I support comprehensive immigration reform. And the challenge is going to be, before the election, it was hard to get Republicans even to Startup 2.0. Now I think they'll all be with us on Startup 2.0, but will they be willing to go to full comprehensive immigration reform is to be determined.
What are some of the other areas that you see as important over the next 2 years, 4 years, in terms of other things we can be doing to help startups, to help open up opportunities for innovation in energy, education, health, in these areas?
Well, I do think getting crowdfunding and crowdsourcing right. And right now, as we all know, the place to kind of try this out in the safest way is already with accredited investors. So, how do we use these tools and try that first, and as we kind of, the SEC works through, and we need to keep the pressure on. There's a lot of interest in this space. We've been holding forums. We had one at the museum in Northern Virginia a couple of weeks ago, and then we also did one in Norfolk. We're going to one in Blacksburg. The power of this tool, I keep coming back to rural areas. Part of the promise of the information age was you can build it anywhere. We've shown you can build it in Shanghai. We've shown you can build it in Mumbai. We've not really shown that well that you can build it in rural America. And this is enormously important if we're not going to have, a kind of a tech-savvy 21st century job communities and those communities that are, left behind. This is a really important thing. I know you're DC focused, but we all ought to be concerned about that as Americans. I think I've stirred the pot a little bit on some of the questions about regulatory reform. We have to get the regulatory balance right. I am not one of the believers that regulations per se are bad. Lord knows I didn't even fully appreciate how wacky things had gotten in the financial sector. And I say this as somebody who spent 20 years around the markets until I came to the Senate and dug in. And trying to get that balance right is really hard. Some of the concepts that I've looked at is, can we do regulatory lookbacks? One of the things we don't do very well within our regulatory structure, is ever go back and look at what regulations have outlived their usefulness. Did they ever accomplish their goals? How do we do this in a structure that is appropriate? As well as, right now, I view with some level of skepticism in the cost-benefit area, both the benefits sometimes that come out of an agency, which they say, this is going to save X thousands of lives, which sometimes I question. On the other hand, though, I very much question, every time industry's response is that this is going to cost, X trillions of dollars. So is there a way to create some kind of more independent referee that would be trusted by both sides around this cost-benefit area? So the whole area of regulatory reform, this is kind of, I can imagine as entrepreneurs, your eyes will start to glaze over on this, but this is a space that we need work on. I do think energy is the notion of revisiting our energy mix and having a real energy policy, which we've not had for maybe forever in the country, and trying to find a way to price some of the externalities. I don't think anybody's going back to a cap-and-trade system, but are there other ways to look at getting some of the externalities costed into our energy system? I think that will be revisited post again debt and deficit. And then a subset of the health area that I think is very, very, very significant, with the Affordable Care Act, which has got lots of flaws in it, but it is going to press, and we should have had in that bill much more transparency in terms of forcing providers and others to provide pricing. But I really think if, again, as a subset area, that if I was starting out again, the combination within health IT and mobile applications to both live your life more healthily and become a better consumer of health is a hot space.
So that was going to be my next question, totally switching gears. As you
Sure.
said, you've been an investor longer than you've been a politician. So if you were 25 today and you were just getting into the game, you're young Mark Warner again, what would be the big opportunities you'd be tackling right now? What are the exciting places these guys should be looking at?
I would, let me just rattle off a number of categories. I'm not sure I would say one trumps another, but I thought for a long time that energy would be the space if I was going to restart, that would be the case. One of the things I always, and I'm unsure of, in the telecom world, when I first started, everybody on Wall Street, everybody in the big Bell operating companies, as we started in the wireless business, all said, this is going to be important business, but it's going to take 30 to 35 years to build out a wireless network in America. And at the end of that time, 5% of Americans are going to have mobile phones. Thank God they were wrong. I got rich off of that. But what didn't happen was we got much quicker to a tipping point. And one of the things that I always believed was we would get quicker to that tipping point in energy delivery than we have. And I think those of us who are in between being governor and senator, I actually started a renewable energy fund. Didn't do that well, just as many of the others didn't do that well. Part of that was around pricing, part of that was around policy, part of that was around the explosion around natural gas. But the truth is it may be harder to kind of get to that tipping point in energy. I still think we need to continue to think about energy sources that are more locally generated without the kind of massive distribution network. So energy I'd still put as this area. I mentioned cyber, I mentioned health. I do think education is nobody I think has cracked the code on how we really use the promise of technology to change how we educate kids. We've made lots of efforts, we've moved some, but as somebody that was very current on this, at least until I left the governorship, the buzz was better than the results. Those are some of the areas that I would be digging into.
Excellent. I think we have time for one quick question from the audience. So if anybody has a question for the senator.
Questions, comments, suggestions? Yes, ma'am. one, I don't sit on, Judiciary Committee handles most of this. I don't sit on the Judiciary Committee. I do think that, I didn't support SOPA or PIPA, but I think that the kind of outrage from the technology community around SOPA PIPA almost went too far because it scared off reasonable, rational 21st century ways to protect intellectual property. Whether it's copyright, or I think about, we've got a really successful company in Virginia called Rosetta Stone. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it in terms of language stuff. The amount of intellectual property theft that's taking place right now, particularly from foreign websites, rogue websites. I've been to the facility in Harrisonburg where they've just got walls and walls of, kind of the Hall of Fame of rogues. The technology community needs to help us get this right because it is very, very important, not just for you, but for all, as we continue to create more content, how it's protected. And again, I particularly think it's easier to protect domestically than it is on a foreign basis. And rather than just kind of getting, I think there was, again, I didn't support SOPA PIPA. I'm very publicly against SOPA PIPA, but I think we sometimes got a little shrill on it.
Cool. Well,
one more? I want to take one more and then I'll get out of it.
Alex?
Whoops.
Senator, you mentioned cybersecurity. The Senate failed to move forward with that bill. White House is talking about EO. Most of the people I talk to who cover the space who deal with it, though, are a bit more concerned not about non-state actors, but about the risk to consumers and businesses. When we talk about that in a general sense, what measures is the Senate willing to make in the next couple months or in the first part of next year to protect American consumers and businesses who are facing losses of their IP, but in ways that don't harm American civil rights?
Well, again, this is where the question, a lot of this is boiled down to, are we going to have standards or are we not going to have standards? And I think if the American public knew how many times we were attacked on a daily basis, knew how many, particularly financial institutions, were being ripped off on a regular basis, there would be a much more heightened concern about this. And some of the things I know from the Chamber and others who have been, this is again not unlike anything around intellectual property protection. There is no simple, straightforward answer, kind of getting this balance right and recognizing we may have to come back and adjust. I mean, one of the things about all this, this shouldn't be big news, but Congress never gets it fully right the first time. And one of the things that has been problematic in Congress over the last few years is, when we take on a piece of legislation, then it always becomes afterwards, rather than let's fix it, it's repeal or nothing. So you end up with imperfect legislation, whether it's Dodd-Frank or healthcare or others. We need, hopefully, in moving forward, we'll be able to come back and fix things. In terms of cyber in particular, I get some of the business community's concerns, but those who are meeting the standards and who are kind of leaders in the field, why they would be willing to kind of allow lower level performers that could end up harming a whole industry sector seems to me to be a contradiction. It would seem there'd be almost an indirect subsidy to those businesses not putting appropriate safeguards in place. And so I have been kind of, at the macro level, more believing that there ought to be some level of set standards, whether that standards are developed in conjunction with industry and government, and some enforcement. Clearly, you also need some level of if you, and I understand that the standards and I think the challenge here is because this space is evolving so quickly, are the standards going to be able to change on such a rapid basis that you're always going to be chasing the standard and you're going to have to be constantly, hitting. You're never going to be fully protected. I would believe if you hit that standard, you ought to get some safe harbor component around it.
Great. We'll sit. I think at this point we're getting the signal from.
Getting the high sign.
I think.
Well, let me just close with this. One, thank you guys for being here. Two, we need you to be successful. I mean, we've all heard the statistics. All net new jobs, or 80% of all new jobs created by startups. This is the space, because you don't kind of fit in a traditional box. Until some of the very good work that Steve and others did with the President's Commission and other things, you've not had your voice necessarily always heard in Washington. I hope you, as a former venture capitalist, former entrepreneur myself, that you will, if I can be helpful, copyright and others, my offices are open to that. I do think, getting crowdfunding, crowdsourcing right is going to be very important in the short term. I do think getting immigration reform, at least Startup 2.0, and then hopefully more comprehensive, is going to be terribly important. And I really would challenge you to help us think through how we not just do this in DC, Northern Virginia, and suburban Maryland, but that we do it all across the country, because that really is making sure that you can actually live wherever you want to live to, and you shouldn't have to leave your hometown to find a world-class job. That was the promise that those of us who were involved in this in the 90s all said. We ought to try to make it a reality. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.